At 3 a.m., the private wing of the hospital didn't smell like medicine. It smelled like defeat. Henderson Ricky, a man whose name usually commanded the tides of the city's underworld, stood paralyzed as the rhythm of his legacy. His son, Dustin, stuttered into a jagged final tremor. For 15 minutes, the best surgeons fought a losing battle against a seizure that refused to break, until finally the monitors surrendered to a single, unwavering tone. The lead doctor stepped back, on his head bowed in a silent apology that no mafia boss ever accepts. Time of death, 3:07 a.m. The world went cold, but as Henderson reached out to touch his son's cooling hand, the heavy silence was pierced by a voice that shouldn't have been there. A woman in a stained maid's uniform, standing in the shadows of the supply closet, began to hum. It wasn't a hymn or a prayer. It was a low-frequency, rhythmic vibration that seemed to make the very glass of the ICU quiver. As she stepped into the light, her eyes locked onto the boy's still chest, her voice rising into a melody so private, so ancient, it had been buried in a grave 10 years ago with Henderson's wife. Suddenly, the flatline jumped. Then again. Dustin's chest heaved with a violent, life-affirming gasp as the machines screamed back to life, synchronized perfectly to the stranger's notes. Henderson's hand flew to his holster, the click of his safety echoing in the stunned room. And he wasn't looking at his revived son, he was looking at the woman in the uniform, realization dawning with terrifying clarity. She didn't just save his son, she held the only biological override code left in the world. Henderson's gun hand was steady. It was the only part of him that was. Every instinct honed across 2 decades of running Philadelphia's most feared syndicate told him to close the distance, to press the barrel against this woman's sternum and extract every syllable of the truth from her before she could breathe wrong. His son's chest was still rising and falling in the hospital bed. Rising and falling, a miracle that 10 seconds ago had been impossible, and the woman responsible for it was standing 3 feet away in a yellow-aproned maid's uniform, watching him with eyes that held no fear whatsoever. That was what unsettled him most. Not the song, not the resurrection. The absence of fear in someone who was staring down the barrel of his gun. "Who sent you?" His voice was a low instrument, the kind that didn't need to be loud to fill a room. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze traveled to Dustin, a brief, assessing sweep, the way a physician checks a patient, not the way a stranger looks at a sick child. Her hand, still pressed to her own sternum from the exertion of the melody, relaxed slightly. Whatever she had been looking for in the boy, I asked you a question. And Dustin needs a cardiac specialist who understands resonant biology, not a man with a gun interrupting a stabilization window. She tilted her head toward the monitors. His delta waves are still synchronizing. Loud sounds are a problem right now. Henderson took 1 step forward. She took none backward. From the corner of the room, one of his men, Pruitt, who had been posted outside the door and had slipped in at the sound of the flatline alarm, shifted his weight, hand moving toward his jacket. The doctor who had declared Dustin dead 4 minutes ago was pressed against the far wall, white coat trembling, smart enough to understand that whatever was happening in this room was well outside any medical board's jurisdiction. The woman in the yellow apron glanced at Pruitt. Then she looked at the ceiling. Henderson followed her gaze. The sprinkler heads. He understood 1/2 second too late. From her left sleeve, something small and cylindrical caught the overhead light, a compressed canister, no larger than a perfume bottle, and she drove its pin against the metal bed rail in a single, practiced motion. The release was almost silent, but the chemical signature that bloomed upward was not. The hospital's smoke detection system, calibrated to detect the earliest molecular traces of combustion, registered the compound before it was even visible to the human eye. Every sprinkler in the private wing of Jefferson Hospital opened simultaneously. The room became chaos in a single breath. The doctor threw his arms over his head. Pruitt stumbled back, instinctively shielding his face from the cold cascade. Henderson kept his eyes open, kept his gun level, and kept his feet moving toward her, but the woman was already moving with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment. She didn't run for the door. She moved laterally, past the crash cart, past the IV tower, towards the supply closet she'd emerged from, and Henderson caught a flash of yellow apron as she hauled open the grate of the hospital's linen ventilation shaft. A wide industrial chute that ran from the surgical floor down through the building's service core. "Ah, stop!" She dropped into it like a stone into a well. He reached the grate in 4 seconds, looked down into the dark, heard nothing but the hiss of the sprinklers and the shriek of the fire alarm pulling the entire 3rd floor into emergency protocol. By the time his men would clear the corridor, she would be through the basement linen room, past the loading dock on Walnut Street, and dissolved into the grey Philadelphia pre-dawn. Henderson holstered his weapon. He stood there, water running down the back of his collar, and looked at his son. Dustin's chest was still moving. The monitors, though rattled by the suppression spray, showed a cardiac line that was almost normal. Whatever the woman had done, it was holding. The frequency will hold for approximately 4 hours. She hadn't been threatening him. She hadn't been bargaining. She'd been giving him a deadline dressed up as information. And he'd spent those seconds pointing a gun at her instead of listening. Henderson turned to Pruitt, who was already pulling out a phone. "Pull every service exit recording from Jefferson between 3 a.m. and now. Every loading dock, every alley camera from Walnut to Chestnut." Pruitt nodded, moving fast. But Henderson already knew the cameras wouldn't give him what he needed. The woman hadn't left through a door. She'd left through a frequency. And he had no idea yet how to follow that. If this story has you hooked, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Chapter 2 drops next, and the trail gets stranger. The footage was 43 seconds long, and Henderson had watched it 19 times. Pruitt had pulled the ICU's internal recording from Jefferson's security archive before the hospital's legal team could think to flag it. A grainy, wide-angle feed from the ceiling-mounted camera above Dustin's bed. The timestamp read 3:04 a.m. in the upper left corner of the frame. Barely visible in the shadow of the supply closet doorway, a figure in a yellow apron stood with the absolute stillness of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. Then the flatline tone. Then her mouth opened. The audio on the hospital feed was standard grade, functional, the kind of system designed to catch code blue alerts and staff disputes, not the granular acoustic architecture of what this woman was doing. To the untrained ear, to every trained ear in that room, and apparently, it had sounded like singing. A melody, unusual in its intervals, unsettling in its calm. Henderson needed someone whose ear was anything but untrained. By 9 a.m., he was sitting in a converted row house off Passyunk Avenue in South Philadelphia, watching a man named Ed Orlan unwrap a set of headphones the size of satellite dishes. Ed had spent 11 years as a signal intelligence contractor for a defense firm outside of Quantico, Virginia, and had before a classified dispute over intellectual property had ended his federal career and deposited him, quietly and permanently, into the kind of work that paid better and asked fewer questions. Henderson had used him twice before, once to verify a wiretap, once to locate a transmitter inside a supposedly clean vehicle. Ed had never failed to find what was hidden inside sound. Hospital-grade audio capture. Ed turned his monitor toward Henderson without looking up. 48 kilohertz sampling rate. Good enough for evidence, not good enough for this. For what? For what she was actually doing. He pulled up a spectral analysis on a secondary screen, a visual representation of the recording's full frequency range, rendered as a landscape of peaks and valleys in electric blue. The human vocal range sat in the middle, clearly visible. But above it, pushing toward the upper boundary of the graph, was something else entirely. A dense, unstructured cluster of activity that the hospital's microphone had captured only partially, like the tip of something vast submerged just below the surface. Henderson leaned forward. That band right there. Ed pointed to the cluster. 18 to 22 kilohertz. The human ear stops registering around 20, give or take. Dogs hear it, certain marine mammals, and apparently... He paused, clicking through to a zoomed rendering. Whatever this woman embedded into her vocal performance. Embedded. That's the word I'd use. Ed finally looked at him. His expression carried the careful neutrality of a man who had learned never to react to what he found inside other people's secrets. This isn't incidental harmonic bleed. These frequencies are structured. They repeat in intervals. There's a pattern here that somebody designed, Henderson. Somebody who understood psychoacoustics at a level that's either academic or military. The row house felt smaller suddenly. Outside on Passyunk, a delivery truck rumbled past, oblivious. Philadelphia going about its Tuesday morning with no knowledge that somewhere in its grid, a woman who could weaponize a lullaby was moving freely through its streets. Can you decode it? Ed exhaled slowly. Given time and the right comparative samples, maybe. The ultrasonic layer appears to contain sequential data. Think of it like a carrier wave. The melody is the surface. What's riding underneath it is something else. Could be a neurological trigger sequence, could be an encrypted signal, could be both simultaneously. He shook his head once, not in refusal, but in something closer to reluctant admiration. Whoever designed this understood that the human brain processes frequency before it processes language. She didn't just sing to the boy. She transmitted directly into his nervous system. Henderson sat with that for a moment. His wife had been a composer. People had said it like it was a soft thing, a hobby, a grace note in the biography of a mafia boss's elegant spouse. She had studied at Curtis, Philadelphia's own conservatory, one of the most demanding music institutions in the country. She had understood sound the way Henderson understood leverage, as a tool, as a pressure point, as a way to move things that refused to be moved by ordinary means. He had never thought to look closer. I need the full decode, Henderson said. Whatever is inside that frequency, I need to hear it. Ed nodded, already turning back to his equipment. I'll need something to compare it against. A baseline recording of the same melodic structure performed in a clean acoustic environment. Without that, I'm reverse engineering in the dark. Henderson stood. He knew exactly where a baseline recording might exist. He hadn't opened the door to his wife's music room in 4 years. The key still sat on his ring, between the one for his office safe and the one for a storage unit in Camden, New Jersey, that held things he'd once thought he might someday need. It turned out someday had arrived precisely on schedule. The key felt heavier than he remembered. Henderson stood in the third-floor hallway of his Chestnut Hill estate, or the kind of address that Philadelphia's old money had occupied for generations before newer, quieter fortunes began moving in alongside them. The house had 17 rooms. He knew the function of 16 of them. The 17th was behind the door in front of him now, a dark mahogany panel at the end of the east corridor that he had walked past 800 times in 4 years without stopping, because stopping meant deciding. And he had decided long ago that some griefs were better left sealed. Audra's name wasn't on the door. It didn't need to be. The whole room had been hers in a way that resisted explanation. She had chosen the wood, the window orientation, the acoustic paneling that lined the interior walls. She had told him once that sound behaved differently in a properly designed room, that a space could be tuned the way an instrument was tuned, and he had nodded and kissed her temple and understood nothing she meant. He unlocked the door. The smell reached him first. Not decay. The room's climate control had maintained itself dutifully, indifferent to its owner's absence. But something more like preserved stillness. Cedar and old paper, and the faint ghost of the amber perfume she had worn. Henderson pushed the door fully open and stood in the threshold for a moment before stepping inside. The piano occupied the center of the room. A Bösendorfer Imperial, 97 keys, black lacquer so deep it looked less like an object and more like an opening in the floor. Audra had shipped it from a private auction in Vienna, Austria, before Dustin was born, and Henderson had signed the insurance documents without reading the amount, because the look on her face when she'd described it had made the number irrelevant. Around the instrument, bookshelves held composition notebooks with her handwriting down their spines. Sheet music was arranged in lateral files, labeled by date. A drafting table near the north window still held an unfinished score, the ink long dry, the notation stopped mid-phrase, as though she'd simply stepped away to get coffee and had not yet returned. He made himself cross the room. The composition notebooks were his first instinct, and he pulled 3 from the shelf at random, 2019, the year before she died, flipping through pages of her precise, architect-like musical notation. And her handwriting had always been better than seemed fair for someone who also played at the level she did. Most of what filled the pages looked like standard compositional work. Melodic sketches, harmonic progressions, tempo markings in Italian. But in the margins, threaded between the formal notation like a second conversation running parallel to the first, were sequences of numbers. Long, structured strings that bore no resemblance to any musical annotation he'd ever seen. Henderson photographed every page. Then he turned to the piano. Up close, the Bösendorfer was immaculate. Whoever had installed the room's environmental systems had understood what the instrument needed: consistent humidity, stable temperature, no direct light. The keys were dust-free. Someone had maintained this room with a care that went beyond what his household staff knew to provide, because he had told them explicitly that the studio was to remain locked and untouched. And he pressed a single key. Middle C. The note rang out clean and full, resonating in the acoustically treated space with a warmth that was almost unreasonable. Then he noticed the resistance. Not in the key itself. Mechanically, it moved perfectly. But at the base of the key's travel, a fraction of a second after the hammer struck the string, there was a faint secondary sensation, like a micro-switch completing a circuit beneath the action. He pressed it again, slowly this time, watching the key's full depression. At the bottom of its arc, something engaged. He found Pruitt on the second floor and had him upstairs in 90 seconds. It took another 20 minutes, a flashlight, and the removal of the instrument's lower panel to confirm what Henderson had begun to suspect. Beneath the Bösendorfer's action rail, integrated with surgical precision into the instrument's existing wiring, ran a network of hair-thin fiber optic threads. Each key had been retrofitted with a contact sensor. The threads converged at the base end of the piano's internal cavity, where they fed into a device no larger than a hardback novel, matte black, with a single port and a ventilation grill. A server. Active. Its indicator light pulsing a slow, patient green in the dark interior of his wife's piano. "It's running," Pruitt said, which was unnecessary, but Henderson understood why he'd said it. Some things needed to be said aloud to become real. The server was drawing power from a secondary line Audra had installed during the room's original construction, a dedicated circuit that had been feeding this device quietly, continuously, for what could have been years. Whatever it contained, it had been waiting, maintained, protected. Henderson stared at the pulsing green light. His wife had not simply composed music in this room, she had built something. And somewhere in Philadelphia's grid, a woman in a yellow apron already knew exactly what it was. Ed called it a dead zone, the way a radiologist might describe a shadow on a scan, clinically, precisely, with the understanding that the word carried more weight than its syllables suggested. The concept was straightforward enough once Henderson grasped it. Veronica's jamming device, whatever it was, operated on the same ultrasonic frequency band that Ed had isolated from the hospital recording. To suppress that band in a given area, the device had to broadcast a counter-signal, a cancellation wave, and to cancel something, you first had to produce it, which meant the device itself was generating a detectable acoustic signature, subtle and fast, and not designed to be caught by anything less than Ed's specialized equipment, but there nonetheless. In every neighborhood where Veronica was operating, and a small bubble of carefully shaped silence would exist inside the city's ambient frequency spectrum. A ghost who moved by creating the precise shape of her own absence. "She's been busy," Ed said, sliding a printed map across the table in the Passyunk row house. He'd spent 18 hours cross-referencing signal anomalies from Philadelphia's network of environmental noise monitoring stations, sensors maintained by the city's Department of Public Health, primarily for traffic and construction data, not acoustic counterintelligence. But data was data. "I found 7 anomalies across a 4-day window. Look at the distribution." Henderson looked. The marked locations formed no obvious cluster. Fishtown, Graduate Hospital, for a pocket near the Reading Terminal Market in Center City. One in Germantown, deep in the northwest, a neighborhood of old stone houses and steep hills that Henderson associated with university faculty and people who did not wish to be easily found. The points seemed scattered until he stopped looking at where they were and started looking at what connected them. They formed a corridor, not a straight one. It moved like water finding its path through uneven terrain, but a corridor nonetheless, and it was moving northeast. "She's not hiding," Henderson said. "She's traveling. Traveling and working." Ed tapped the Germantown marker. "This anomaly lasted 6 hours. That's not transit, that's a work site. She set up somewhere in that radius and operated long enough for the suppression field to leave a clear signature." He paused. "Whatever she's doing it methodically. This isn't someone running scared. This is someone executing a plan." That landed the way truths landed when they rearranged things, quietly, with permanent effect. Henderson had spent 2 days thinking of Veronica as prey. Adjusting that frame was not comfortable, but he was a man who had survived 20 years in an industry that killed people who mistook their assumptions for facts. He adjusted. By midday he had Pruitt and 2 others working a quadrant search through Germantown, and not looking for Veronica herself, but for the absence she left. Neighbors who'd noticed interference with wireless devices, shopkeepers whose card readers had inexplicably failed during a 4 to 6 hour window in the last 72 hours. It was the kind of canvassing that police would take days to organize. Henderson's people were thorough by a different kind of motivation, and they were faster. The return call came before 3 in the afternoon. A woman who ran a small alterations shop on Germantown Avenue reported that her entire point-of-sale system had gone unresponsive for nearly 5 hours 2 nights prior. She'd assumed it was a router issue. Across the street, a retired postal worker had complained to his neighbor that his hearing aids, which operated on a specific frequency band, had produced sustained interference that evening. He'd considered calling the manufacturer. The address they triangulated from those 2 data points was a narrow 3-story building 4 blocks off the avenue, its ground floor a defunct laundromat, its upper floors occupied by what city records listed as a private acoustic research consultancy registered in Delaware 18 months ago. The registration name meant nothing to Henderson. The Delaware angle meant everything. It was the structure someone used when they needed a legal entity that discouraged curiosity. His wife had maintained a Delaware LLC. He had signed the incorporation documents without reading them because she had handled her professional arrangements independently, and he had never thought to look closer. He was developing a very uncomfortable relationship with that particular phrase. Standing on the sidewalk across from the building in the late afternoon grey, Henderson counted the windows. Our third floor, one window with its shade drawn against the daylight at an angle that was slightly too precise. Not the casual pull of someone seeking privacy, the calculated geometry of someone managing light for a specific purpose. He reached for his phone to call Pruitt in from the perimeter. Before the call connected, the shade on the third floor shifted. Just slightly. The adjustment of someone who had been watching the street and had seen what they were looking for. And she already knew he was there. The question now was whether she'd left the door unlocked on purpose. She had left the door unlocked. Henderson went in alone. He'd told Pruitt to hold the perimeter on Germantown Avenue and not move unless he heard something that warranted moving, which was a deliberately vague instruction, because he was operating on instinct now rather than protocol. Instinct told him that arriving at Veronica's door with armed men would produce the same result as arriving at the hospital with a drawn weapon. She would simply disappear again, and the next time it might take longer to find her than Dustin had hours to spare. The defunct laundromat on the ground floor smelled of old detergent and pipe rust. A staircase at the rear led upward through darkness. He climbed it without a flashlight, one hand trailing the wall, listening for anything that suggested ambush, and hearing nothing except his own footsteps and the muffled city sounds pressing through the building's old bones. The third floor was a single open room. She was waiting for him in it, not with a weapon, not braced against a wall with an escape route calculated. She was seated at a folding table with 2 cups of coffee that were still producing steam, which told him she had watched him cross the street, measured how long it would take him to climb the stairs, and timed the coffee accordingly. The yellow apron was gone. In its place she wore a dark jacket over a grey shirt, her dark hair pulled back from a face that was composed and watchful and completely unbothered by his presence in the way that only people who have already modelled every version of this conversation tend to be. Henderson sat down across from her. He did not reach for the coffee. "You were at the Germantown building for 6 hours," he said. "What were you doing? Maintaining the suppression envelope around Dustin's monitoring frequency?" Her voice was even, academic almost. "The kill code has a refresh cycle. Every 72 hours, if it doesn't receive a counter-signal, it resets toward activation. I've been running that counter-signal remotely since the night at Jefferson." She paused. "You have approximately 41 hours before the next cycle." The number landed in his chest like a piece of cold hardware. "Who are you?" "My name is Veronica Ashwell. I have a doctorate in psychoacoustics from Penn and a second research appointment I held jointly through a private laboratory in Maryland that no longer officially exists." She met his eyes without flinching. "I was your wife's research partner for 6 years. Audra didn't compose music, Henderson. She engineered it. The compositions were delivery systems. She was building a neurological therapeutic framework using targeted acoustic frequencies, and I was the scientist who helped her translate the theory into something that could actually work on a human nervous system." Henderson said nothing. The room held the ambient percussion of the city filtering through the walls. Distant traffic, a door somewhere below, Philadelphia going about its indifferent night. "She never told you?" Veronica said. It was not a question. "She told me she was a composer. She was protecting you. And Dustin. The research attracted attention from people who monetize biological leverage. When she realized what was coming, she made a choice to keep the 2 of you insulated from the parts that could get you killed." Something shifted in Veronica's expression. Not softness exactly, but a recognition of weight that she had been carrying for a long time. She was the most methodical person I have ever known. The server in the piano, the numeric sequences in the composition notebooks, the Delaware entity. She built a containment system around her own work, so that if anything happened to her, there would still be a trail. A trail only someone who knew to look for it could follow. She expected to die. She expected the people who wanted the research to try to stop her from finishing it. She was correct about that. The Scepter Regional Rail ran somewhere beneath the city's foundations, and Henderson felt the faint tremor of it through the floor, the pulse of a system moving people through the dark, along routes they trusted without thinking. He had built his entire career on the principle that knowledge was leverage. The discovery that his wife had understood this better than he did, and had simply chosen to apply it differently, was doing something to him that he couldn't yet name. "The maid's uniform," he said. "Hospital security logs staff by uniform category, not identity. A maid gets to a patient room faster than a visitor. Audra kept one in the Maryland lab for the same reason. She called it the most useful disguise in any American city, because no one looks directly at the person wearing it." Henderson finally reached for the coffee. "Tell me about the kill code," he said. "Tell me who put it in my son." Veronica's hands wrapped around her own cup, and the careful equilibrium in her face tightened by a fraction. The expression of someone preparing to say something that will permanently alter the geography of another person's world. "That's the part," she said quietly, "that involves someone you trust. We name the traitor soon. Subscribe now and be there when the truth breaks." Henderson set down his coffee cup with the deliberate care of a man making sure his hands stayed visible and still. "Oh, say the name." Veronica didn't look away from him. Whatever she had expected from this moment, anger, denial, the instinctive defensiveness of a man whose entire architecture of trust was about to be condemned, she seemed to have prepared for all of it. Her steadiness was not coldness. It was the composure of someone who had rehearsed this conversation for a long time and understood that how she delivered it mattered as much as what she said. "Lucas Pell." The name moved through Henderson like a current finding ground. Lucas Pell had been on his council for 11 years. A financial architect, not an enforcer, the kind of man who wore understated suits and spoke in the careful, subordinate clauses of someone trained to make complex things sound simple. Henderson had brought him in from a Philadelphia wealth management firm after the man had quietly solved a liquidity problem that 2 other advisors had declared unsolvable. And he sat third chair at every strategic meeting. He had attended Dustin's 8th birthday. He had stood at the back of Audra's funeral with his hat in his hands and his expression arranged in the geometry of grief. "Walk me through it," Henderson said. His voice was level. "All of it." Veronica turned her cup slowly on the table, a small organizing gesture. "The pharmaceutical syndicate that funded our Maryland research, Audra and I called them the Harrow Group because we never learned their legal name, approached the project as a technology investment. Acoustic neurological intervention was worth billions in therapeutic applications alone. When Audra realized they intended to weaponize it instead, to develop a biological compliance mechanism they could install in people without consent, she moved to take the research off-grid. A pause. What she didn't know was that Harrow already had someone inside your organization, someone who could provide access. Access to what? To Dustin. Veronica's voice didn't soften, because softening it would have been a form of dishonesty, and they were past that. The kill code isn't a disease. It was never a disease. It's a precisely engineered acoustic implant, a bioresonant trigger that was introduced into Dustin's neurological system through a modified auditory stimulus when he was 4 years old. He would have experienced it as nothing more unusual than a brief, pleasant sound. She watched Henderson absorb that. Lucas arranged the access, a private developmental assessment Dustin attended in New Jersey, Cherry Hill, at a clinic that was Harrow's operation behind a legitimate pediatric practice. The implant was introduced during what Dustin's medical records describe as a routine auditory processing evaluation. Henderson remembered the appointment. He had not attended it personally because there had been a complication that week with a shipment moving through the port. Audra had taken Dustin. She had come home and said the assessment had gone well, and that Dustin was developing normally, and Henderson had filed it in the category of things that did not require his further attention. And he had built his career on the principle that knowledge was leverage. His wife had understood this. The Harrow Group had understood this. Lucas Pell had understood this. Henderson was only now catching up. Audra found out, he said. 6 months before she died, she identified the implant during a routine frequency analysis she ran on Dustin as part of our general research. She recognized the architecture immediately because it was a corrupted version of our own work. Someone had taken her foundational research and engineered it into a control mechanism. Veronica's jaw tightened briefly. She didn't tell you because telling you would have required telling you about Lucas. And she didn't yet have proof that would survive the conversation she knew you would have with him immediately afterward. She was building the countersignal. The lunar echo was designed specifically to neutralize the implant's kill code trigger. She finished the primary sequence 8 weeks before her accident. Veronica let that word, accident, sit in the room without comment, because the comment was unnecessary. I've been maintaining what she started, running the countersignal remotely, monitoring Dustin's frequencies, making sure the implant stayed suppressed. But remote maintenance has limits. The night at Jefferson, Harrow activated a forced cascade sequence, something designed to overwhelm remote suppression. I had to be there in person to override it. The building settled around them. Somewhere on Germantown Avenue, a car alarm cycled through its sequence and went quiet. Henderson sat with 11 years of proximity to Lucas Pell laid out in his memory like a floor plan, re-examining every room, every conversation in which Lucas had been present when Dustin's health was discussed, every medical decision that had passed through his hands. The shape of the betrayal was enormous and intricate, and had been standing inside his house the entire time. He'll know the night at Jefferson failed, Henderson said. He already knows. Harrow will have told him. Veronica reached into her jacket and placed a small drive on the table between them. Matte black, identical in form to the server beneath the Bosendorfer. Everything Audra documented about the implant, the counter sequence, and Lucas's communications with the Cherry Hill Clinic is on this. She built you a case, Henderson. She just needed you to be ready to use it. He picked up the drive. Outside, Philadelphia was doing what Philadelphia always did, enduring, indifferent, perpetually in motion along its grid of old streets and older grievances. Somewhere across the city, and in a room Henderson had paid for and trusted, a man in an understated suit was almost certainly making a phone call that would set something into motion before morning. 41 hours had been the number Veronica had given him. That window was now considerably shorter, and Lucas, knowing the Jefferson intervention had failed, changed the geometry of everything. Henderson stood. I need to move Dustin. I know. Veronica was already on her feet. And Lucas will be expecting you to do exactly that, which means the location you choose cannot be one that any member of your council has ever known about. The problem with that condition, Henderson understood immediately, was that Lucas had been the person who managed the records. Every safe location Henderson owned was already compromised. The Academy of Music on Broad Street was the oldest opera house in the country still operating in its original building, and Henderson had chosen it precisely because it was not his. No deed, no lease, no record connecting Henderson Ricky to the chandelier-lit grandeur of Philadelphia's most celebrated performance hall. But what he had instead was a relationship with its overnight security contractor, a quiet arrangement that had existed for 3 years and cost him less per month than the maintenance on his Patek Philippe, and a knowledge of the building's sub-basement that predated the current management by 2 administrations. He moved Dustin at 2 a.m. in an unmarked medical transport, Veronica riding in the back with equipment she'd retrieved from the Germantown building, and Pruitt driving with the focused economy of a man who understood that silence was the appropriate register for what they were doing. Dustin was stable, conscious, confused, asking questions that Henderson answered in the abbreviated language of a father who was holding too many things at once to hold a full conversation. The boy's eyes were his mother's. They always had been. Henderson had spent years treating that fact as a tenderness, and was only now understanding it as a communication. The Academy's sub-basement was a different geography than the gilded tiers above it. Exposed brick, iron pipe, the accumulated mechanical infrastructure of a building that had been breathing since 1857. Veronica established her equipment near a load-bearing column in the deepest room, away from the building's wireless interference zones. Dustin was settled on a cot with a Loro Piana wool blanket that Pruitt had retrieved from the estate, and that looked faintly absurd in the industrial surroundings, though no one remarked on it. By 3 a.m., Henderson was in the main hall. He stood in the dark of the orchestra level, among the empty velvet seats, beneath a chandelier that held the ghost light of the city filtering through the upper windows. The hall smelled of old wood and brass polish, and a century and a half of accumulated performance. It was a place built for consequence, for moments that an audience would carry home and not immediately understand. He had brought 4 of his men, Pruitt and 3 others whose loyalty he had graded as absolute over a combined 30 years of proximity. He had not told Lucas where they were going, which was why, when the side entrance on Locust Street opened at 3:22 a.m., and the figures who came through it were not police or Harrow operatives, but faces Henderson recognized: Terran Gill, who handled port logistics; Bowden Krause, who had been at his table for 9 years, and 2 others whose names he had spoken without hesitation in rooms where names meant something. He understood the architecture of it immediately. Lucas had not needed to hire outsiders. He had simply called in what he was owed. The negotiation, such as it was, lasted approximately 40 seconds. Terran spoke for the group, a function of his particular talent for making dangerous things sound reasonable, and what he said reduced to this. The Harrow arrangement was profitable, Dustin's condition was a manageable variable, and Henderson's resistance to the situation was the only element that remained to be resolved. The phrasing was diplomatic. The 4 men positioned in the hall's perimeter were not. Henderson had spent 20 years building an organization on the principle that loyalty was a structure, not a sentiment, that it required maintenance and investment, and the kind of ruthless consistency that left no ambiguity about cost. He had maintained it. He had simply failed to account for the separate structure that Lucas had been building inside his own, with Harrow's money as the mortar. What followed was not elegant, or the Academy of Music deserved better than what happened to its south wall sconce and the plaster medallion above the dress circle in the next 4 minutes, and Henderson would later arrange for the repairs through 3 intermediary contractors to avoid paperwork. But when the last of Terran's group was contained, disarmed, zip-tied to the ornate brass railings of the mezzanine, in a scene that would have struck any observer as a profound misuse of a registered historic landmark. And Bowden Krause was sitting on the stage apron with his expensive Brioni jacket torn at the shoulder and his willingness to discuss Lucas Pell's current location considerably elevated. Henderson allowed himself one slow breath. Pruitt appeared at the stage door. One look. "Dustin?" Henderson asked. "Stable. Veronica says the frequency held." The chandelier above the empty hall caught a shift in the ambient light, some cloud movement over Philadelphia's night sky, and threw a brief, scattered refraction across the velvet seats. For a moment the hall looked the way it was meant to look, full of something worth witnessing. Henderson turned back to Bowden. "Lucas's location," he said, "and then we discuss what your cooperation is worth." Bowden Krause gave up Lucas Pell's location with the resigned efficiency of a man who had already calculated which betrayal was survivable. A rented floor of the Rittenhouse Hotel on West Rittenhouse Square, $1,200 a night for a corner suite with a view of the park's bare November trees and the kind of anonymous luxury that Philadelphia's most expensive address provided to people who needed to be unreachable without appearing to hide. Henderson knew the building. He had attended a charity dinner in its ballroom 4 years prior, seated 3 tables from the mayor, Audra beside him in a dress the color of deep water, or her hand warm against his arm every time he leaned to speak with someone. He had not thought about that evening in years. He thought about it now, crossing Broad Street in the pre-dawn dark with Pruitt beside him, and understood that memory was doing what it always did in the hours before something irreversible, arriving uninvited with evidence of what was at stake. They never reached the hotel. Veronica's call came through at 4:17 a.m., and her voice carried a frequency of its own, compressed, precise, stripped of everything except the essential. The cascade is accelerating. Harrow must have triggered a secondary sequence when the opera house went quiet. I'm losing ground on the suppression. A pause that lasted exactly as long as necessary. He needs the full lunar echo. Live in the room. Henderson, I cannot do this alone. The final movement requires a second acoustic source, or the resonance doesn't complete. Audra designed it that way deliberately. He stopped walking. She designed it to need 2 people. She designed it to need you specifically. Veronica's voice didn't waver. The final sequence is keyed to a lower register that I cannot produce. Audra's own vocal range couldn't reach it either. She wrote it for a baritone. She wrote it for someone who would have every reason to be in that room and every reason to finish what she started. Another pause. She left the notation in the composition notebook you photographed. Page 47. The passage she marked with a single asterisk and no other annotation. Henderson had the photographs on his phone. He pulled them up as Pruitt turned them back toward the academy without being asked, already understanding from one side of the conversation what the other side had said. Page 47. A single staff of notation in Audra's precise hand, 8 bars long, marked with one small asterisk in the upper margin. He had looked at it in Ed's row house and filed it as a fragment, an incomplete thought. He understood now that it was the opposite. It was the only part she had been completely certain of. The sub-basement of the Academy of Music had not improved in atmosphere during their absence. Dustin was upright on the cot, his Loro Piana blanket pushed aside, his eyes carrying the particular alertness of a child who understands that adults are frightened and has decided that his own composure is the contribution he can make. Looking at his son in the dim utility light, but Henderson saw Audra so completely that it required a deliberate internal adjustment to keep moving. Veronica had her equipment arrayed around the column. She handed Henderson a single sheet, the notation from page 47, printed and annotated with phonetic guidance below each bar. She had prepared this before she called him. She had known what the conversation would produce. I don't sing. Henderson said, You don't need to perform, and you need to resonate. She positioned herself to his left, the precise acoustic geometry of it apparently mattering in ways he couldn't fully perceive. The frequency is what matters, not the beauty. Audra knew your voice. She built the range from memory. She met his eyes. She trusted that you would be here. That's why she wrote it this way. He looked at the notation. 8 bars, 41 notes, the work of a woman who had understood, in the final year of her life, that the most secure place to hide the solution was inside a melody that only her husband's voice could complete. Henderson Ricky, whose name had moved cargo through 3 states and settled disputes that courts couldn't touch, who had not sung anything since a church in South Philadelphia when he was 9 years old, looked at his son's face. He began. The first notes were imperfect, uncertain in their placement, rough at the edges in the way that anything true and unrehearsed tends to be. But as Veronica's voice rose alongside his, the 2 registers finding each other in the acoustic chamber of the old brick room, something shifted in the quality of the sound. It became less like two people performing and more like a single, complete thing that had been waiting for its missing component. On the monitor beside Dustin's cot, the delta wave pattern, which had been climbing its distressed, irregular ascent for the past hour, began to smooth. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way a tide recedes, steadily, with the patient authority of something operating according to laws older than the people watching it. By the fourth bar, Dustin's breathing had deepened. By the seventh, the monitor showed a cardiac rhythm that Veronica, without breaking her own notes, confirmed with a single nod. Henderson sang the final bar alone. Veronica had stepped back from the last four notes, her exit written into the score, he now understood, because Audra had wanted this last phrase to be entirely his, a private closing of something that had been left open. A conversation between a husband and the wife who had trusted him with the answer before he even knew the question. The final note left the room slowly, the old brick holding it a moment longer than seemed acoustically justified, and then it was gone. Dustin exhaled. His eyes, when they found his father's, and were clear in a way they had not been in longer than Henderson wanted to calculate. "Dad," the boy said, "were you singing?" Henderson stood in the middle of the room his wife had saved from the outside and said nothing for a moment. Around him, the Academy of Music held its ancient, indifferent dark above, and somewhere in the city, Lucas Pell was sitting in a Rittenhouse suite, calculating odds that had already stopped being accurate. "Your mother wrote it," Henderson said finally. "I just finished it." Veronica began packing before the monitors had fully settled. It was a practiced efficiency, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned to leave cleanly, without the sentiment that made departures complicated. She broke down her equipment with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, folding cables, securing components into a case that was matte black and unremarkable and worth more than most people's cars. But Henderson watched her from across the sub-basement room while Pruitt sat with Dustin, who had fallen into the first genuinely restful sleep he'd managed in 72 hours, his breathing steady and deep against the Loro Piana blanket. "You're not staying," Henderson said. It was not a question. Staying creates a fixed point. She sealed the case and turned to face him. A fixed point can be found. What Audra built was a distributed system, no single location, no single guardian. That's what kept it alive for 4 years after she died, and that's what will keep Dustin protected going forward. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket and produced a device he recognized in form, if not in function. Slim, black, about the dimensions of a luxury fountain pen, with a single recessed button at one end, and a ventilation grill that matched the server beneath the Bösendorfer. This runs the counter signal continuously. Passive, self-sustaining, at range of approximately 30 feet. Keep it within that distance of Dustin at all times, in his room, in his bag when he travels. The signal it produces is indistinguishable from standard residential wireless interference. She set it on the equipment case between them. No one will know what it is, including Dustin, for now, until he's old enough to understand what his mother built for him. Henderson picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. The thought that his son's continued life now rested in something this light and this quiet struck him as either absurd or precisely appropriate, and he couldn't determine which. "Lucas," he said, "is your problem to solve, not mine." A pause. "The drive I gave you contains everything a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania would need to dismantle Harrow's domestic operations and trace the Cherry Hill Clinic back to its licensing shell in Delaware. How you use that information, whether you use it, is a decision that belongs to the kind of man you're choosing to be after tonight." She held his gaze with the directness that had been consistent from the first moment she'd stepped out of the shadow of that supply closet. Audra believed you were capable of making that choice correctly. She said it once, near the end, when we were discussing what would happen if the worst came. I'm telling you because she would have wanted you to know. There was no adequate response to that. Henderson understood this and offered none. Veronica lifted the equipment case. Pruitt materialized from the far side of the room to escort her to the Locust Street exit, a courtesy and a precaution simultaneously, the two things not being mutually exclusive in Henderson's world. At the doorway she paused without turning fully around. "The server in the piano," she said. "When you're ready. It contains 6 years of Audra's complete research. She always intended for it to reach the right institutions eventually. Not Harrow, not anyone who would monetize it." Another pause, briefer. She wanted it to help people. Then she was gone, her footsteps receding up through the Academy's infrastructure and out into the Philadelphia pre-dawn. And Henderson stood alone in the sub-basement of the oldest opera house in the country, with his son sleeping nearby and a device the size of a pen in his hand that contained the last piece of his wife's architecture. He spent the next 3 hours making decisions. By the time Dustin woke, Henderson had contacted a federal attorney he had never spoken to for personal reasons, a distinction that mattered in ways that would become clear over the following weeks, and transmitted the contents of Veronica's drive through an encrypted channel that Ed reached at 5 a.m. in his Passyunk row house, established without asking for context. The Harrow Group's domestic infrastructure would take time to unravel. Lucas Pell, I'd reached by Philadelphia field agents at his Rittenhouse suite at 7:15 a.m. in his monogrammed Charvet robe, would take considerably less. At his Chestnut Hill estate that afternoon, Henderson unlocked his office safe. A Dirtling Comet, brushed steel, the kind of vault that Swiss engineers designed for documents worth protecting, and removed the records he had maintained across 20 years of operation. Physical ledgers, contact directories, and the accumulated paper cartography of an empire built on leverage and proximity and the studied application of consequence. He burned them in the garden fireplace. The Mont Blanc pen he had used to sign the first of those ledgers he placed on the mantel of the music room beside the Bösendorfer, where it would remain as the only monument he permitted himself. Dustin found him there as the last of the afternoon light came through the north window across the piano keys, those 97 black and white surfaces beneath which a server still pulsed its patient green, holding 6 years of his mother's work, waiting for its proper destination. "Are you okay?" Dustin asked, with the grave, assessing directness of a child who had spent too much time in hospital rooms and had developed a physician's instinct for reading people against their will. Henderson looked at his son. Brown eyes, his mother's precision in them, her quality of attention that took things apart quietly and put them back together in a different order. "I'm getting there," Henderson said. Outside, Philadelphia moved through its evening in its habitual, indifferent way. The city that had held Audra's music in its foundations for years without knowing it, that had sheltered a frequency trail through its Germantown hills and its center city corridors and its oldest performance hall, that had been the geography of a secret war fought entirely below the threshold of what anyone could hear. The pen device sat in Dustin's jacket pocket, running its quiet signal into the room. Henderson sat down at the piano. He did not play, and he simply placed his hands on the keys, those same keys beneath which his wife had wired her life's most important work, and let them rest there in the fading light, feeling the faint, familiar resistance of a mechanism that had been waiting, all this time, to be properly understood. He had been, he now knew, the last note she ever composed.